Right now, you are connected, whether you are watching this on a phone, a tablet, a laptop, or a television. You are connected to something that is largely invisible. Most of the infrastructure that makes it work exists behind walls, beneath streets, under oceans, and in buildings you will never enter. You do not see it, you do not feel it, you barely think about it. But it is there. Messages are traveling across fiber optic cables right now. Data is moving between servers and cities on other continents. Satellites overhead are relaying signals across distances that were once considered impossible to cross quickly. Your screen refreshes in milliseconds because millions of machines are coordinating with each other in real time, continuously, without pause. The scale of it is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind all at once. In the time it takes you to blink, more information moves across the global internet than any library in the world contains. The system is vast, layered, distributed across hundreds of countries, and maintained by thousands of organizations that rarely coordinate directly, but somehow produce something coherent enough to feel seamless. And most of the time, you do not think about any of it. The internet feels permanent, stable, a fixed feature of existence the way roads and electricity feel fixed, something that was there before you arrived and will be there after you leave. A background condition of modern life rather than a specific technology with a specific history that could, under different circumstances, be different. But imagine this. Tomorrow morning, you wake up at your usual time. The light comes through the window the way it always does. Everything in the room looks exactly the same. You reach for your phone. No notifications. Not the usual cluster of messages and updates waiting since you last checked. Nothing. The screen loads but nothing connects. You try your home network. You restart the router. You watch the lights blink through their sequence and settle into what looks like a normal connection. You try again. Nothing loads. You switch to mobile data. Still nothing. The signal bars are there, but nothing responds on the other end. You open a few different apps, streaming services, a search engine, a messaging app. Nothing opens. Everything that depends on a live connection simply waits. Loading indicators that spin and then stop. Screens that stay blank. You check the news app. Nothing. You try a browser. Nothing. You walk to the window. The street outside looks normal. Cars moving, people going about their morning. Nothing visibly wrong. You check your phone again. Still nothing. It is not just your house. You call a neighbor on your phone. Voice calls still connect. They confirm it. Same thing on their end. Same thing, it turns out, on everyone's end. The internet is gone. Not slow, not partially down, not recovering from a regional outage. Gone. Completely and silently absent, without explanation, without warning, without countdown. Just silence where there used to be constant noise. At first, it feels like a glitch, something temporary, some massive server failure or cable cut that will be repaired within hours. You have lived through internet outages before, brief interruptions that resolve before you have time to significantly change your plans. You assume this is the same thing, just bigger. You try refreshing apps, you close them and reopen them. You restart your device. Nothing changes. You check your offline apps, your camera still works, your notes still open. Any music you downloaded directly to the device still plays. The device itself is functioning. It is only the connection that is absent. And within minutes of that absence, you feel something you did not expect to feel quite this quickly. Restlessness. Not the dramatic restlessness of crisis, something more reflexive than that. You reach for your phone without deciding to. You find yourself opening it without intending to check anything specific. You are already looking at the screen before you register that you picked it up. You put it down. A few minutes later, you reach for it again. This is when you begin to notice something that was always true, but that you never had occasion to observe clearly. How often you reach for internet access. Not to do anything particular. Not to find specific information. Just reflexively, automatically, the way you might absently tap a finger on a table. A habit so ingrained it operates below the level of intention. Every small gap in time. Every transition between tasks. Every moment of mild boredom or slight uncertainty. The phone, the connection, the constant option to look something up, check something, confirm something, see what's happening somewhere. You had not realized how much of your mental restlessness the internet was quietly absorbing. Now, there is nothing to absorb it. The gaps remain gaps. By the first afternoon, the practical disruptions are becoming clearer. News stations cannot update their websites. Not that websites are loading anyway. Online stores have stopped processing orders. Banks have frozen digital transactions pending some understanding of what is happening. Email servers are not sending or receiving messages. In the first several hours, the mood is more confused than alarmed, because no one knows what happened. There is no announcement. Television broadcasts, which still work, carry initial reports that are thin on detail. A widespread global internet disruption, cause unknown, no timeline for restoration. Radio carries similar messages. Officials are investigating. Television and radio continue to function because they are broadcast systems that do not depend on internet infrastructure the way digital services do. Local power grids are intact. Phone calls still connect. The physical world, the roads, the buildings, the air is unchanged. But the systems layered on top of that physical world are struggling. Credit card machines at stores stop working as they lose the ability to verify transactions through online networks. Some stores switch immediately to cash only. Some close temporarily. Online banking apps are entirely unusable. Rideshare services, which exist only as software connected to servers, are gone. Food delivery services vanish as completely as if they had never existed. People stand at ATMs that display errors. They search pockets and wallets for physical cash they have not needed in months, possibly years. Something else surfaces in the first day that is more quietly revealing than the operational disruptions. People cannot reach the people they want to reach. Not because phones are broken, voice calls still work, but because many people do not know the phone numbers of people they contact regularly. Those numbers lived in messaging apps, in social media profiles, in contact lists synced to cloud services that are no longer accessible. Years of contact information stored in a place that is now unavailable. You find yourself thinking of specific people and realizing you cannot reach them. Not because the infrastructure to reach them does not exist, but because the digital layer through which you knew how to reach them is gone. You realize, in a specific and uncomfortable way, how much memory you had outsourced. By the end of the first week, it is clear that this is not a temporary outage. Businesses built entirely on online infrastructure are in genuine crisis. Remote workers cannot access the systems they use. Cloud-based platforms for project management, for file storage, for communication, for almost everything that modern knowledge work runs on, are inaccessible. Online retailers cannot process orders, cannot communicate with suppliers, cannot update inventory. Some companies had offline redundancies built into their systems. Others had local backups. Many had neither, because offline redundancy felt unnecessary in a world where the internet had never gone away. Supply chains begin showing strain within days. Modern logistics is deeply dependent on internet systems, for tracking shipments in real time, for coordinating between suppliers and distributors, for managing the timing of deliveries across global networks. Without that real-time coordination, inefficiencies that were previously invisible become significant. Grocery stores still have food. Physical inventory does not disappear. But restocking slows as the systems used to manage it become unavailable. Banks open physical branches for longer hours and begin handling more transactions manually. Paper forms come back out of storage. People who have not written a paper check in years are writing them again. Schools and universities close temporarily while administrators figure out what to do. Online learning platforms, which had become central to education long before any crisis, and which became even more so after the pandemic-era expansion of remote learning, are inaccessible. Digital assignment systems, research databases, library portals, all gone. Students and teachers are left with whatever physical materials exist in their buildings. Libraries, which had been quietly underused for years in many communities, become suddenly important again. People arrive looking for books, for printed reference materials, for the kind of information that exists on paper rather than in a database. For the first time in a long time, information is not instant. News travels on the schedule of television and radio broadcasts. You cannot check what is happening somewhere in the world at any moment of your choosing. You wait. You listen. You piece together a picture from sources that come in waves rather than continuously. Rumors spread, but locally. Without social platforms to amplify a piece of information globally in seconds, misinformation still exists but does not go viral in the way it did. It travels at the speed of conversation rather than the speed of data. The emotional pace of receiving information changes. There is silence between events. No constant refresh. No real-time scroll. You find out about things when someone tells you or when a broadcast covers it. And in that quiet, in the gaps where the constant stream of updates used to run, something unusual begins to happen. People start talking to each other, not performing for an audience or posting for engagement, just talking, face to face, in the immediate shared physical world. By the second week, the silence has stopped feeling like an interruption. It feels structural now, like a condition rather than an event, something to navigate rather than wait out. Governments and institutions release statements through television and radio. The message is cautious, but clear. The internet is not returning on any near-term timeline. The end of the centuries was not destroyed in any simple mechanical sense, but something has made it non-functional at a scale that requires repair efforts across dozens of countries simultaneously, with limited ability to coordinate those efforts without the very system they are trying to repair. The irony is not lost on the engineers working on the problem. Rebuilding internet infrastructure is much harder when you cannot use the internet. One of the first sectors forced into serious adaptation is banking and finance. Modern financial systems run on digital infrastructure in ways that are not always visible to the people who use them. When you swipe a card at a store, that transaction moves through several different network systems in under a second. When you transfer money between accounts, it passes through verification layers and communication protocols that depend on secure server connections. When a stock is bought or sold, it happens through electronic trading systems that process thousands of transactions per second. All of that stops. Within days of the outage, banks begin limiting withdrawals from physical branches. ATMs that store some data locally can handle limited transactions, but most shut down as their connection requirements go unmet. Lines form at physical bank branches that have not seen this kind of volume in years. Paper forms come back, manual ledgers, transaction records that are handwritten rather than digital. The staff at bank branches work longer hours processing more transactions more slowly. Large stock exchanges suspend trading. The digital systems on which modern financial markets run are not supplementary to the markets. They are the markets. Without them, there is no mechanism for the trading of financial instruments at any meaningful scale. Cash becomes immediately more valuable, not because of inflation or policy, but simply because it is the one medium of exchange that works without any connectivity. People who happen to have physical cash on hand have something others need. People who relied entirely on cards and digital payments find themselves unable to buy things at stores that can no longer verify transactions. The financial system does not collapse. It contracts, it slows. It becomes local and manual in ways it has not been for decades. But the underlying reality that money represents, the agreements between people about the exchange of value, does not disappear. People adapt the mechanisms by which they participate in it. Remote work disappears almost immediately in a way that reveals how thoroughly the nature of many jobs had changed. For much of the past decade, a significant portion of professional employment had shifted away from physical location. Cloud-based tools allowed teams distributed across cities and countries to collaborate on documents in real time, to communicate through messaging systems, to attend meetings through video platforms, to access everything they needed from any device with an internet connection. All of that ends in an instant. Companies that relied on remote teams must either reconvene their workers in physical offices, which requires office space that may no longer exist, in cities where employees may no longer live, or suspend operations until some alternative can be established. For industries built entirely around digital delivery, the situation is more severe. Digital marketing agencies have no way to reach digital audiences that no longer have access. Online retail platforms have nowhere to operate. App development companies build products that have no users because the delivery mechanism no longer exists. Data analytics firms lose access to the data streams they analyze. Streaming platforms, which displaced physical media over a decade, have no way to stream. Entire categories of employment that were created by the internet pause or disappear. However, not all work stops. Construction continues. Local manufacturing continues. Farming continues. Healthcare continues. Work that depends on physical presence, on bodies in specific locations doing things that cannot be done remotely, becomes more stable than it has been in years, relative to the digital alternatives that are no longer available. Physical work regains a visibility and a practical importance that it lost during the long shift toward digital convenience. The person who fixes things, grows things, builds things, and delivers things in the physical world becomes essential in ways that do not depend on any connectivity. Modern transportation systems are more deeply tied to digital networks than most people realize until those networks are gone. Airlines use online systems for booking, for scheduling, for coordinating routes, for communicating with crews and ground staff at different airports. Without those systems, most commercial aviation effectively halts while the industry figures out how to operate with manual alternatives. Some limited flights continue, run by carriers that had maintained paper-based backup systems, but air travel becomes rare and expensive almost immediately. Shipping companies that move cargo across oceans use digital tracking and coordination systems to manage their fleets and inventory. Trucking companies rely on GPS navigation, digital dispatch, and centralized logistics platforms. Without internet connectivity, these systems must revert to radio communication, paper documentation, and significantly less efficient routing. GPS navigation itself continues to function in a basic sense. The satellite signals that enable it are independent of the internet, but the digital map updates, traffic data, and route optimization that made GPS so useful are no longer available. People navigate using printed maps, which were still being produced but had become rare in many households. The physical movement of goods and people does not stop, but it becomes slower, less efficient, and more dependent on direct human judgment than on algorithmic optimization. Long-distance supply chains, the global networks through which goods move from manufacturers in one country, through distributors and wholesalers, to retailers and ultimately consumers, show stress within weeks. Those networks were designed around the assumption of digital coordination. Without it, they become harder to manage in real time. Local supply becomes more important. Regional economies, which had been largely absorbed into global networks, begin to matter in their own right again. Hospitals and healthcare systems face significant administrative disruption without fundamentally collapsing their core function. Electronic health records, the digital systems through which patient information is stored, shared between providers, and accessed at the point of care, become inaccessible. Hospitals revert to paper charts and handwritten documentation. Physicians who have not maintained physical records in years find the transition disorienting. Pharmacists cannot verify prescriptions through digital systems and must rely on phone calls and faxes. Communication between hospitals, which have become almost entirely digital, becomes dependent again on telephone lines and the physical transfer of documents. Coordinating patient care across facilities becomes slower and more error-prone. Emergency services continue operating with relatively less disruption. Ambulances and emergency rooms do not require internet connectivity to function at a basic level, but the administrative layers around emergency care slow considerably. Telemedicine, which had expanded significantly in the years before the outage, and which many people depended on for routine care, becomes unavailable. Patients who had been managing conditions through remote monitoring devices lose that monitoring capability. The healthcare system does not fail. Its fundamental purpose, treating people who are sick or injured, continues. But the efficiency and reach that digital infrastructure had enabled are lost, and the system is more manual, more local, and more limited than it had been. Schools and universities lose something more than a tool. They lose an entire mode of operation that had become the default. Online learning platforms disappear. Assignment portals are inaccessible. Research databases, through which students and academics access the majority of academic literature, go dark. The digital communication systems through which teachers assign work, students submitted it, and grades were recorded become unavailable. Students who were mid-semester find themselves without access to course materials that were hosted online, without the ability to submit work through digital portals, without the tools they had been using for research. Physical textbooks, which had been declining in adoption in favor of digital resources, regain importance immediately. Libraries become crowded. The physical card catalog, which many libraries had retired, becomes a topic of nostalgic practical conversation. The pace of learning shifts in ways that are not entirely negative. Without the option to have multiple tabs open while reading, without the notifications arriving during study time, without the ability to immediately look something up at the cost of losing a thread of thought, attention is forced to sustain itself differently. Research requires more sustained engagement with fewer sources. Writing requires more reliance on what you already know and remember rather than what you can instantly look up. Some students find this genuinely difficult. The habits built around instant access to information do not transfer easily to patient engagement with physical sources. Others find something quieter and more focused opening up. News no longer spreads the way it did. The media environment of the internet era was characterized by continuous updating, by the expectation that major events would be known globally within minutes, by the compression of the cycle between event and public reaction to something approaching real time. Without social platforms, that cycle slows dramatically. Journalists produce reports for television and radio broadcasts on their standard schedules. Print newspapers and magazines, which had been shrinking for years, become primary sources of written information again. Local radio stations, which had been struggling financially, suddenly have large audiences listening for local information. Information becomes more localized. You know more about what is happening in your immediate region and less about what is happening globally. This is not simply because less information exists. It is because the infrastructure for distributing information globally in real time is gone, and the infrastructure for local distribution still works. The emotional texture of receiving news changes in a way that is difficult to anticipate until you experience it. Without the real-time reaction cycle that social platforms created, where a piece of news would immediately generate thousands of public responses that were themselves part of the story, events are received more quietly. Outrage does not trend globally within the hour. Debates unfold over days rather than minutes. There is time between becoming aware of something and forming a public response to it, for private thought to develop. This does not mean the absence of conflict or disagreement. Those continue. But the mechanism by which emotional reactions are amplified across large populations simultaneously is absent. The tempo of public discourse slows. The silence between events, which once felt empty or worrying during the internet era, begins to feel like an ordinary feature of how things are. After 2 weeks, something begins to shift in the texture of daily experience. You stop checking your phone every few minutes, not because you make a decision to stop. The decision is not that deliberate. It is simply that the habit weakens from disuse. You reach for the phone, find nothing there, put it down. Fewer times each hour, and then fewer times each day. You notice the gaps in time that the internet used to fill. Every small pause, the few minutes waiting in a line, the transition between finishing one task and starting another. Sitting alone before someone you are meeting arrives. The 15 minutes before sleep. The first few minutes after waking, the internet had been filling those gaps continuously, silently, without your having made any explicit choice to fill them. And now that it is absent, the gaps are just gaps, empty moments that have to be occupied differently, or simply experienced as what they are. Some of these moments feel uncomfortable. Boredom is a specific sensation that most people in the internet era rarely experienced purely, because the means to escape it were always within arm's reach. Without that escape, boredom presents itself clearly. Some of these moments feel different in a way that is harder to name. Quieter than boredom, less urgent. Something more like presence. You start reading physical books in longer uninterrupted stretches, because there is nothing to interrupt. You find yourself in conversations that sustain themselves past the point where someone would usually look at a phone. You notice the physical details of places you are in, the light, the sounds, the way a room feels, in a way that passive background attention rarely captured. Your attention, which had been structured around rapid shifts between small inputs, begins to stretch, not suddenly or dramatically, gradually, the way a muscle adapts to use. Some businesses adapt quickly. Others do not survive the transition. Local stores with physical inventory and the ability to accept cash continue operating with relatively minor adjustment. Farmers markets, which had been growing as a preference for local food, already become significantly busier. Repair shops for appliances, electronics, furniture, clothing see demand increase substantially as people cannot order replacements online and must instead fix what they have. Locally operated restaurants that deal primarily in cash and do not rely on delivery apps continue with limited disruption. Contractors, tradespeople, and service providers who work directly with local clients are largely unaffected. The businesses that struggle most are those built entirely on digital delivery. Software companies, platform businesses, digital media organizations, and those that relied on global supply chains so heavily that local disruption of coordination has cascading effects. Small-scale local manufacturing, which had been losing ground to cheaper global supply for decades, finds renewed practical importance. When global supply chains slow, the things that can be made locally become more valuable. Local currencies and barter arrangements begin appearing in some communities, not as formal policy, but as practical solutions to the reduced availability of cash and the unavailability of digital payment. People trade services and goods directly. Informal economies that had been secondary become primary in some neighborhoods. The practical lesson of this transition is one that economic historians have noted across different periods of disruption. Economic systems are more adaptable than their current form suggests. The mechanisms change. The underlying reality of people exchanging value persists. Over the months that follow, the ways the absence of the internet is changing individual experience deepened and become more visible. The most significant change is not economic or logistical. It is something more internal. For years, a large portion of daily life had a dimension of potential visibility. You could photograph a meal and share it. You could post your thoughts on something and receive reactions. You could document your experiences in a form that existed beyond memory, in a publicly accessible archive that others could view, comment on, and respond to. Even for people who use social platforms minimally, the option existed, and the option shaped behavior in subtle ways that were hard to see while the option was present. You sometimes chose experiences partly based on how they would appear in a shared format, a place worth photographing, an event worth documenting. You sometimes measured your life against the visible lives of others, a comparison made possible by the continuous publication of curated highlights. You sometimes performed in small ways for an imagined audience, even in moments of private life, composing a caption in your mind for a photo that did not get taken, framing a thought as if it might be shared. Now that system is gone. There is no feed, no algorithm presenting you with the curated lives of others. No public metric measuring the reception of what you share. No comment section beneath your experiences. Your life becomes less performative in a way that takes adjustment. At first, the absence feels like something missing, a way of processing experience, turning it into communicable form, releasing it into a network of responses that was familiar and now unavailable. Then something else develops, a different relationship to your own experience. Less immediate translation into shareable content. More time in which experience is simply experienced before it becomes story. More room for the private interpretation of things before any public version is considered. This shift is not universal or uniformly positive. People who had built professional identities around their online presence lose those identities in a practical sense. People who had used online communities for genuine support, around health conditions, around shared experiences, around identities that are underrepresented locally, lose access to those communities. The loss is real. But the shift in how experience is held, more privately, more locally, less continuously translated into content, is something many people find themselves unexpectedly valuing. For years, the content served to you by internet platforms was shaped by algorithms designed to maximize your engagement. The news articles that appeared in your feed, the videos that played next, the opinions that were amplified, the products that were suggested, none of this was random or neutral. It was optimized based on your past behavior to keep your attention engaged. This had effects that were not always obvious while the system was running. Your informational world, the topics you knew about, the perspectives you encountered, the events you considered important, was shaped by a system designed around engagement rather than around accuracy, balance, or your long-term understanding of anything. Your emotional responses were part of this. Content that provoked strong reactions kept you engaged longer. Outrage and anxiety were effective engagement mechanisms. Over time, repeated exposure to content optimized for reaction shaped not just what you knew, but how you felt about things. Without internet platforms, that optimization disappears. Your informational world narrows geographically. You know less about what is happening far away, but expands in a different dimension. The information you receive is filtered by editors and producers who have their own biases, certainly, but who are not running real-time optimization on your engagement. Television schedules are fixed. Newspaper editions are finite. Radio programming has structure. The emotional intensity of your informational diet decreases, not because there is less to care about in the world, but because the mechanism that was amplifying emotional responses continuously is gone. Your attention, freed from constant optimization designed to capture it, begins to settle into different patterns. You read longer things more easily. You sit with complexity rather than reaching for the quick summary. You tolerate uncertainty about questions for longer before feeling compelled to resolve them. Researchers who had been studying attention fragmentation in the internet era had predicted this would happen given sufficient time offline. The prediction turns out to be accurate. Relationships, without the infrastructure of messaging apps and social platforms, take on a different character. The internet had made it easy to maintain what social scientists call weak ties, loose connections with large numbers of people. A comment here, a reaction there, occasional messages to people you would not call on the phone. These ties are not worthless. They constitute a network through which information flows, through which opportunities are discovered, through which a sense of broad social connection is maintained. Without digital infrastructure, weak ties become very difficult to sustain. You cannot easily maintain contact with hundreds of people who live in different cities through occasional digital interaction when all digital interaction is unavailable. Your social circle contracts. This is experienced as loss. Specific people, friends from other stages of life, acquaintances from different cities, connections made online become unreachable or so difficult to maintain contact with that the connection effectively ends. But the circle that remains becomes more active, more reciprocal, more deliberately maintained. You call people on the phone, real calls, conversations that have beginning and middle and end rather than the asynchronous text exchange of messaging apps. You write letters occasionally, a practice that died so thoroughly in the internet era that many people have to remind themselves how it works. You make plans to see people in person, which requires more effort than it used to, but creates something different from digital contact. Local community strengthens. Neighborhood organizations gain members and meeting attendance. Community boards become primary sources of local information. Religious institutions, community centers, libraries, and local clubs see increases in participation that they have not seen in years. Physical proximity becomes a basis for social connection in a way that it had partially ceased to be when digital proximity was possible regardless of geography. People who live near each other know each other better. This is not without its own tensions. When community is local and unavoidable, the people who disagree with you are also your neighbors. There is no algorithm that removes from your view the people whose perspectives conflict with yours. You navigate difference directly, in person, at close range. This is uncomfortable in some ways. It is also, arguably, a more honest form of social life. The sense of personal identity shifts over time in ways that are subtle but significant. Before the outage, many people had substantial digital archives of themselves. Social media profiles going back years, photos organized in cloud storage, documented opinions, old posts, captured moments from different stages of life. A public record of who you had been and how you had presented yourself. That archive is now inaccessible, not destroyed. The data presumably still exists somewhere, but effectively unavailable. Your past exists only in your own memory and in the memories of people who shared it with you. Printed photographs, if you have any. Physical journals, if you kept them. The accounts of people who were there. The self becomes less archived, less documented, less verifiable. There is a kind of freedom in this. Old opinions that you held publicly are not permanently accessible to anyone who wants to search for them. Earlier versions of yourself, preserved in digital amber, are not available to be compared to who you are now. The past is somewhat less recoverable, which means the present is somewhat more fluid. There is also a kind of loss, the continuity of documented experience, The ability to look back at specific moments with photographic specificity, to trace the arc of your own life with more than memory, is diminished. Memory, which had been partially offloaded to devices and platforms, must now be held in the mind more fully. This turns out to be both a burden and something else. Things that are held in memory are held differently than things that are stored in archives. They are integrated, interpreted, changed by time and feeling. They are more yours. Cultural life changes more slowly than economic life, but it changes. In the internet era, cultural trends moved globally and quickly. A song released anywhere could be heard everywhere within hours. A style of dress photographed in one city could influence fashion in another city within days. A phrase that went viral in one country could appear in others within the week. Culture was constantly exchanging itself across borders at speeds previously impossible. Without global digital infrastructure, that speed drops dramatically. Music still exists and is still made. It is performed in venues, broadcast on local and national radio, released on physical formats, vinyl, CD, cassette, but it reaches its audience more slowly and through more limited channels. A musician who would previously have had a global audience through streaming platforms now has a regional one through local distribution. The same is true of film, of visual art, of literature, of almost every form of cultural production. Local scenes, regional music traditions, local publishing industries, community theater, regain a cultural prominence they had lost as global platforms made all content compete with all other content simultaneously. The local is no longer in direct competition with everything else that has ever been made. Fashion cycles slow. Without the continuous visual feed of what people around the world are wearing, trends develop over months rather than weeks, and sustain themselves longer before being replaced. Distinct regional styles emerge again in places that had been absorbed into a fairly homogeneous global aesthetic. Cultural diversity in a geographic and regional sense increases. The world is less synchronized. Shared global moments become rare. The experience of an entire world simultaneously watching the same thing, reacting to the same event, participating in the same conversation, which had become a regular feature of internet culture, almost ceases to exist. For those who valued the sense of global connection that those moments represented, this is a genuine loss. For those who felt overwhelmed by the relentlessness of global synchronization, it is a relief. Creative work does not stop. It changes. Writers, artists, musicians, and filmmakers who had built their audiences on internet platforms must find different ways to reach the people who would value their work. Physical publishing increases. Print-on-demand services, local presses, zines, handmade books, methods of distribution that had been marginalized by the efficiency of digital platforms become relevant again. Writers build audiences through local readings, through physical distribution, through relationships with bookstores and libraries. Musicians perform more. Recording still exists. Albums can be made and pressed, but the distribution is physical and regional. The performer who makes a living playing live to audiences in a relatively small geographic area, which had become a difficult model as live music competed with streaming, is now in a more viable position. Artists exhibit locally. Galleries that feature local work become community anchors in a way they had not been when gallery going competed with global digital art platforms. The metrics change. Success is not measured in streaming numbers or follower counts or engagement rates. It is measured in the more immediate and less quantifiable currency of community recognition. Who knows your work? Who shows up when you perform? Who tells others? For many creators, the shift is initially experienced as loss. The possibility of global reach, which the internet had made seem like a reasonable ambition for anyone with talent, is gone. The scale of potential audience is dramatically smaller. But something changes about the relationship between creative work and the audience for it. The distance is shorter. The feedback is more direct. The people who support your work are people you might actually know, who you might encounter in person, whose response to what you make exists in a form that is more immediate than numbers on a dashboard. Whether this is better or worse is a question without a clean answer. It is different, and for some creators, in specific ways, it is better. Now imagine 5 years have passed since the internet disappeared. The acute disruption of the first weeks and months has resolved into a new set of ordinary conditions. People have adapted. New businesses have formed around the constraints of the present. New habits have replaced old ones. A generation of children is growing up who have no memory of the internet, for whom the world as it currently is, with its slower pace of information and its more local social life, is simply the world. Financial systems have restabilized around hybrid models. Some digital infrastructure has been rebuilt within closed local networks, cash usage is substantially higher, and banking is more branch-based than it was before. The global financial integration of the internet era has partially unwound. Regional financial systems are more independent and less synchronized than they were. Employment has restructured. The categories of work that disappeared in the immediate aftermath have not returned. New categories have emerged. Roles in local logistics, in physical publishing and distribution, in the maintenance and repair of systems that are now more local, in the administration of institutions that now rely on more human coordination. The overall employment picture is neither uniformly better nor worse. It is different, reflecting different values and different constraints. Education has adapted to combine physical teaching with the limited digital resources available through local networks. Libraries are significantly better resourced than they were before. The recognition of their importance prompted investment in physical collections that had been declining. Apprenticeship and skills-based training have expanded relative to credential-based formal education. The pace of technological innovation has slowed, but not stopped. Researchers and engineers continue developing new capabilities, but without the global network for sharing information and the vast computing resources of internet-era data centers, progress is slower and more regional. Different regions develop different technical capabilities. The monoculture of the global tech industry, the world in which a small number of companies control platforms that everyone used, has been replaced by a more fragmented landscape of regional technologies. Now imagine yourself 10 years after the internet disappeared. You wake up at a time that your body has settled into, rather than one set by a notification. The first thing you reach for is not a phone. You make coffee or tea or whatever your morning ritual has become over these years, and you think about the day. Your morning does not begin with a scroll through what has happened while you slept, across a world-sized feed of events and opinions and images. It begins with your immediate physical surroundings, the light, the temperature, the sounds outside, the tasks and people and obligations that are yours specifically today. Your work depends on physical presence in ways it did not before. You are in contact with colleagues and clients who share your geographic area. Your professional network is more local, more sustained by direct relationship, less constructed from digital connection. Your entertainment comes from tangible sources. Books you can hold, music performed by people you might know, in venues you can walk to. Films shown in community spaces or on home screens through physical media. Conversations that go long because there is no phone to pick up, no notification to interrupt. Your relationships are fewer in number and more actively maintained. The people you are close to, you are genuinely close to, in both the geographic and emotional senses of that word. You see them with some regularity. You know how they are in a way that is not mediated by their curated presentation of themselves. You still learn. There are books and libraries and local schools and courses, and the replaceable resource of other people who know things you do not. The desire to understand things which the internet satisfied in one way, finds satisfaction through different means. You still create. Without platforms, the motivation to make things that are worth making has not disappeared. It has changed its form and its distribution and its measure of success, but the impulse is as present as it ever was. You still communicate, more deliberately perhaps than before. Each communication requires a little more effort and carries a little more weight for that reason. Your life is grounded in place in a way that feels fundamental rather than limiting. The neighborhood where you live, the community you are part of, the region whose characteristics you know and whose history you share, these things feel more like home and less like one node in an endless global network of possible locations. Return to this moment. The sound has traveled from a recording through a compression algorithm, through a server, through cables and wireless signals, to your device, where software converts it back into something your ears can receive. All of that happened in an instant, invisibly, automatically. You did not arrange it or think about it. It worked because millions of systems were already running, as they always are. You can pause this and resume it exactly where you left off. You can replay any moment. You can share a link to it with someone on the other side of the world who can start listening immediately. You can simultaneously be listening to this and checking something else, or reading something, or communicating with someone. The depth of what the internet makes possible is genuinely extraordinary, but imagining its absence reveals something about its nature that is difficult to see while it is simply present. The internet is not a tool in the way that a hammer is a tool, something you pick up, use, and put down. It is infrastructure in the way that roads are infrastructure. It is woven into the systems that supply your food, process your money, coordinate your work, deliver your healthcare, and structure your access to information and culture. It is so thoroughly integrated into daily life that its removal would not simply be inconvenient. It would be disorienting at a level that touches almost everything. It is also psychology. It shapes how you process experience, how you hold attention, how you form and maintain relationships, how you understand yourself relative to others. Years of using it have left patterns in cognition and behavior that a disappearance would not immediately erase. It is economy. Entire categories of work, entire industries, entire supply chains depend on it in ways that have no near-term offline alternative. It is culture. The way stories spread, the way creative work finds its audience, the way shared experience is constructed globally. These are all functions of internet infrastructure in ways that did not exist 30 years ago. It is identity, how you present yourself, how you document your life, how you maintain connection with the people you have known across distance and time. These practices are so embedded in digital infrastructure that imagining them without it requires imagining a substantially different relationship to your own life. If the internet disappeared, the world would not end, but it would be reorganized slowly, unevenly, in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate because the interdependencies are so deep. The reorganization would produce losses that are real and gains that are real, and the balance between them would be different for different people in different circumstances. And through all of it, humans would adapt. They have always adapted to every change in the infrastructure of daily life, every shift in the systems through which they communicate and work and connect. The adaptation is rarely clean or easy. It is always partial, always incomplete, always leaving something behind. But it happens. The question the absence of the internet poses is not really whether people could survive without it. They clearly could, and would, and in some parts of the world already do. The question is what would be lost, and what would remain, and what new things would emerge in the space created by the absence of something so large. The answer to that question looks different depending on what you valued most about what you had. And perhaps thinking about that, about what you would genuinely miss, and what you might not, is a useful way to understand what you actually have. Right now, in this moment, connected to something invisible and vast, that hums quietly in the background of everything. There is something worth slowing down on, about what the first few days without the internet would actually feel like in the body. Not the logistical disruptions. Those are relatively easy to enumerate. But the felt experience of a nervous system that had organized itself around constant connectivity suddenly encountering its absence. For most adults who grew up with the internet or came of age alongside it, access to online information and communication had become something closer to a reflex than a choice. Not in a pathological sense, but in the same way that checking a mirror before leaving the house is reflexive, a small, nearly automatic behavior woven into the structure of the day. The phone as a device had become an extension of cognitive processing in a fairly literal sense. When you did not know something, you looked it up. When you needed to navigate somewhere, you opened a map. When you wanted to know the time or the weather, or whether a restaurant was open, you checked. The knowledge was not in your head, it was in the device. The boundary between what you knew and what you could instantly access had blurred to the point of irrelevance. Losing that is disorienting in a way that goes beyond the practical inconvenience. You reach for information and find a gap where the information used to be, not just once or twice, but dozens of times in the first day. The reflex fires and nothing comes. You are left, repeatedly, with the awareness that you wanted to know something and have no immediate way to find out. What is the name of that actor? What year did that happen? Is this medication safe to take with that one? What is the correct spelling of this word? How far is it to drive there? Questions that used to dissolve immediately into answers now remain questions. You hold them, or you set them aside, or you find another way. Asking someone nearby, looking in a physical reference, letting the question simply go unanswered. Letting questions go unanswered is a skill that had become largely unnecessary. It turns out to require relearning. The discomfort is real, and it is specific. It is the discomfort of a cognitive habit encountering an obstacle that was not there before. And it passes gradually as new habits form and old expectations are updated. There is something worth considering about what gets lost and what gets preserved in the memories of people who lived through this transition. The internet era produced an unprecedented volume of documentation of personal experience. Photographs by the billions, text messages, emails, social media posts, recorded video, time-stamped metadata tracking not just what was experienced, but exactly when and where. People who grew up with smartphones have more photographic documentation of their lives than their grandparents could have imagined having. Every birthday, every meal considered aesthetically interesting, every trip, many ordinary days, captured, stored, accessible. When that storage becomes inaccessible, the documentation is not destroyed, but it is gone from practical use. What remains of the past is memory and physical artifacts. Printed photographs, if any were printed. Physical journals, if any were kept. The memories themselves. Memory is not a perfect recording system. It edits, interprets, emphasizes some things and allows others to fade. It is shaped by mood and time, and the stories you have told about events afterward. The photographic record, for all its limitations, had provided a corrective anchor, a way of returning to what things actually look like, who was actually there, what the moment actually captured. Without it, memory becomes the primary medium through which the past is held. This turns out to change something about how people relate to experience as it is happening. When you know that no digital record will exist of this moment, when the phone will not be checked for messages during it, and the photo will not be taken of it, the moment is inhabited differently. There is nowhere for attention to go, but here. Whether that is better or worse is genuinely a matter of what you think memory is for and what experience is for. These are not simple questions. Something important happened to the experience of boredom over the decades of internet access. Boredom is a state in which the mind, unoccupied, begins to move. In the absence of external stimulation, it turns inward or outward, to imagination, to observation of immediate surroundings, to the mental chewing of unresolved problems, to the slow emergence of ideas that needed quiet to appear. The psychological research on boredom suggests that it is not simply unpleasant, but functionally useful. Periods of unoccupied time correlate with creative insight, with the integration of disparate information, with the kind of diffuse thinking that produces novel connections. The mind needs to be left alone sometimes in order to do certain things. The internet had largely eliminated boredom as a regular experience for people with constant access to it. Every moment of potential boredom was preemptively filled. The queue at the coffee shop, the wait at the doctor's office, the minute before a meeting starts, the few minutes lying in bed before sleep comes, the walk between one building and another. None of these required boredom anymore. The phone was always there, and the phone was always interesting. When the internet is gone, boredom returns. It is uncomfortable at first, with the discomfort of something unfamiliar, despite being, in evolutionary terms, entirely natural. The mind looks for the usual escape and does not find it. It has to sit with itself. Over days and weeks, something happens. The discomfort decreases. The mind rediscovers its capacity for what the internet era had nearly crowded out entirely, the ability to be somewhere without also being elsewhere. To be in this room, in this moment, without simultaneously being in a network of other rooms and other moments and other people's broadcasts of their rooms and moments. Present. In a simple and somewhat underrated sense of the word. Young people who grew up with constant internet access experience the transition differently than those who have memories of the time before. For adults who remember the pre-internet period, who navigated with printed maps, who used public libraries for research, who maintained contact through phone calls and handwritten letters, who were unreachable by most people for hours at a time on an ordinary day, there is a familiar texture to some of what returns. Not nostalgia exactly, more like recognition. They know how to do certain things that younger people have never learned. How to find information in a physical index, how to read a map and hold a route in mind while driving, how to navigate social situations without the option to check a phone, how to be alone with thoughts for extended periods without filling the time with content. These skills turn out to be more useful than they appeared when they were merely historical. For young people who have never navigated without GPS, who have learned primarily through digital resources, who have maintained social connection primarily through digital platforms, the transition is more disorienting. The tools through which they learn to learn are gone. The social infrastructure they depended on is absent. But adaptation is not generationally limited. Young people adapt too, often more quickly in some respects because they have fewer fixed habits to unlearn. They develop new skills more readily in some areas. They form new social habits with less friction, in part because they have not been doing the old ones for as long. The generation that grows up after the transition, children born into a world where the internet is a historical object rather than a present reality, will have a different relationship to all of this than either group. They will not miss what they never had. They will not be adapting from one mode to another. For them, the world as it is will simply be the world. This is how the experience of a generation becomes the assumption of the next one. It is worth considering, before returning to the present, what the internet actually changed about the experience of being human, not in the grand historical sense, but in the intimate daily sense. Not all of it was loss, and not all of it was gain. It changed the texture of things. It changed what it felt like to be curious. Curiosity used to involve uncertainty. The gap between wanting to know and finding out could last hours or days or longer. That gap had a quality to it. Questions were held and lived with rather than immediately resolved. The internet made curiosity frictionless. You wanted to know, and then you knew. This was wonderful, and it was also something else. A flattening of the experience of not knowing, which had its own value that was hard to see while the means to end it were always available. It changed what it felt like to be far from someone. Before the internet, distance meant that contact required effort and introduced delays. Letters, phone calls at particular times, the knowledge that the other person was living a life you would only partially know about. Distance had a texture. It was felt as separation, as the pull of longing. The internet made distance almost irrelevant to connection. You could be anywhere and still be in constant contact with anyone. This was extraordinary. And it also changed something about the felt experience of being with someone in person, which could not compete with its digital alternative on all dimensions, and therefore lost some of the special quality it had when it was the only option. It changed the relationship between people and the organizations and systems that affect their lives. The internet gave individuals access to information and voice that they had not previously had. It enabled collective action at scales that required institutional support before. It created accountability mechanisms for institutions that had previously operated with less visibility. It also enabled those same institutions, including commercial ones with different incentives than their users, to understand and influence individual behavior at a scale and precision that was previously impossible. It changed what it felt like to be known. Knowing someone now included knowing their public digital presence, their posts and photos and opinions archived online. This added something to the sense of knowing someone. It also changed what it meant to know someone privately, in person, in real time. Whether the sum of all these changes was beneficial or not is a question without a clean answer. It was change, vast and rapid and comprehensive. And the human beings who lived through it adapted to it the way human beings always adapt to large changes, imperfectly, gradually, maintaining some of what came before and losing some of it without intending to. Now, return to this moment. The sound has traveled from a recording through a compression algorithm, through a server, through cables and wireless signals, to your device, where software converts it back into something your ears can receive. All of that happened in an instant, invisibly, automatically. You did not arrange it or think about it. It worked because millions of systems were already running, as they always are. You can pause this and resume it exactly where you left off. You can replay any moment. You can share a link to it with someone on the other side of the world who can start listening immediately. You can simultaneously be listening to this and checking something else, or reading something, or communicating with someone. The depth of what the internet makes possible is genuinely extraordinary. Easy to forget when it is constant. Easier to see when you imagine its absence. The internet is not a tool in the way that a hammer is a tool. something you pick up, use, and put down. It is infrastructure in the way that roads are infrastructure. It is woven into the systems that supply your food, process your money, coordinate your work, deliver your healthcare, and structure your access to information and culture. It is so thoroughly integrated into daily life that its removal would not simply be inconvenient. It would be disorienting at a level that touches almost everything. It is also psychology. It shapes how you process experience, how you hold attention, how you form and maintain relationships, how you understand yourself relative to others. Years of using it have left patterns in cognition and behavior that a disappearance would not immediately erase. It is economy. Entire categories of work, entire industries, entire supply chains depend on it in ways that have no near-term offline alternative. It is culture. The way stories spread, the way creative work finds its audience, the way shared experience is constructed globally, these are all functions of internet infrastructure in ways that did not exist 30 years ago. It is identity, how you present yourself, how you document your life, how you maintain connection with the people you have known across distance and time. These practices are so embedded in digital infrastructure that imagining them without it requires imagining a substantially different relationship to your own life. If the internet disappeared, the world would not end, but it would be reorganized, slowly, unevenly, in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate because the interdependencies are so deep. The reorganization would produce losses that are real and gains that are real, and the balance between them would be different for different people in different circumstances. And through all of it, humans would adapt. They have always adapted to every change in the infrastructure of daily life, every shift in the systems through which they communicate and work and connect. The adaptation is rarely clean or easy. It is always partial, always incomplete, always leaving something behind. But it happens. The question the absence of the internet poses is not really whether people could survive without it. They clearly could, and would. The question is what would be lost, and what would remain, and what new things would emerge in the space created by the absence of something so large. And perhaps thinking about that, about what you would genuinely miss and what you might not, is a useful way to understand what you actually have, right now. Connected to something invisible and vast, that hums quietly in the background of everything.